Hi, my presentation is about green bonds. I'll be talking about what they are, their history, some market trends, and then evaluating Egypt's green bond program, which they launched in 2020. So to start, green bonds are just debt securities issued by organizations for the purpose of financing or refinancing projects that promote sustainability and positively contribute to the environment and climate. They operate the same as conventional bonds, but they're just earmarked for environmental projects, and they're most commonly used for energy efficiency, renewable energy, pollution prevention and control, natural resources and land management, clean transportation, wastewater and waste management, and green building. And as you can see, this graph on the right illustrates just that um, the majority of the funds raised by green bonds have gone towards energy projects, followed by buildings and then transportation. The first green bond was issued in 2007 by the European Investment Bank, and since then the market has rapidly grown. The World Bank then became the first supranational organization to issue a green bond, and their popularity has been driven in part by increasing commitments to environmental protection and countries pledging to implement the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, for example. About 140 countries have um, announced commitments to reach net zero emission levels. And so many of these countries, like India, for example, have plans to issue green bonds to help finance these goals if they haven't done so already. This graph shows the value of green, social, sustainability, and sustainability linked bonds issued between 2011 and 2020 in the US. And as you can see, the value of these green bonds has issued over time has been increasing. And in 2020, these bonds only accounted for 2.2% of the $27.3 trillion US global bond issuances. But again, they've been on an upward trajectory because of investor interest in supporting climate action. On a similar note, this graph shows the global value of green bond issuance in billions of euros from 2014 to 2021, with projected 2022 and 2023 values. And as you can see, the amount and value of green bonds issued globally over the past couple of years has increased dramatically, and many of these bonds have been coming out of Europe and then more recently Asia and North America. Now looking at the pros and cons of green bonds. First, one of the biggest pros of these bonds is their environmental benefits. They're raising funds earmarked for projects aimed to improve the sustainability and reduce emissions, etc. And this is like why they're so important and so heavily talked about today. A study also looked at the top 10 countries that support green finance, and of these 10 countries, 8 have experienced improved environmental quality because of green bonds, and they've also been shown to have a strong positive effect on carbon reductions. Another positive of green bonds is they're very stable. They attract a variety of investors, which diversifies funding, and they reduce reliance on traditional sources of financing for countries, which promotes stability. And then for investors, they're a very low risk investment, and sometimes they even come with tax incentives that make them even more appealing. They do have cons, however. And one of the biggest cons of green bonds is greenwashing. It's a really big concern when it comes to investments of this nature, as issuers sometimes overstate the benefits of the environmental project just to attract investors, and they would then like misuse the funds that they raise. And greenwashing undermines the credibility of the bond market and hinders its growth. On the investor side, the market is not very liquid, which is less appealing for investors, and it also has fairly low yields, which makes other investments just more appealing. And with that, there isn't a lot of research looking at the impacts of green bonds long term since they're such a new concept. So it's hard for investors to make educated decisions about investing when there isn't a lot of research to back them up. But all in all, green bonds are becoming increasingly popular and becoming more and more popular in countries with emerging markets. As you can see, emerging market bond issuance has increased dramatically since 2015, and I wanted to look more at the effects green bonds can have on emerging markets, which is why I'm focusing the other half of this presentation on Egypt. So the Egyptian government established its green financing framework in September 2020 and issued a $750 million green bond. The government of Egypt is committed to achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, which is why it did this. And this marked the first sovereign bond, or the first sovereign green bond in the Middle East and North Africa. So why did Egypt choose to launch a green bond? First, it was a financial solution to meet Egypt's need for environmentally sustainable investments, and it was a good fit for Egypt's medium-term debt management strategy. Egypt wants to diversify its investors and attract new investors, and as of 2020, its domestic debt accounted for about 70% of Egypt's sovereign debt. So debt creditors in Egypt are dominated by commercial banks who are all interested or more interested in short-term debt securities, which puts a lot of pressure on the Egyptian government. So they wanted to adopt a medium-term debt strategy, which would then lengthen the average maturity rate of government debt. This bond is also an opportunity for Egypt to show its commitment to sustainability and achieving the targets set in the Paris Agreement and by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I think also part of the reason why Egypt chose to do this was because it had a lot of support from the World Bank. The World Bank was helping them kind of structure this and make policy for this, which was why it was so successful too. So the bond itself, it has a 5-year maturity. It was initially $500 million with an interest rate of 5.75%, but it once it was issued, it was 7 times oversubscribed and had a lot of interest from investors with offers amounting to about $3.7 billion. So they increased it to $750 million with an interest rate of 5.25. It's going to fund a portfolio of climate-smart initiatives like clean transportation, sustainable water, and wastewater management. 46% of the bond, or of the funds from the bond, was invested in the Cairo monorail project, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And the remaining 54% will be used for several climate activities for the country. More specifically, investments for wastewater reuse, for irrigation and projects to desalinate seawater to meet the drinking water needs for the country. And they successfully were able to attract a diverse range of investors, and some of those investors included asset management companies, pension funds, insurance companies, bank treasuries, private banks, hedge funds, and many more. So funding for the Cairo monorail was a driving factor behind Egypt's decision to launch a green bond. The monorail is one of Egypt's most significant infrastructure developments. It was a $4.5 billion project, and it's intended to improve mobility of the citizens of Cairo, reduce traffic congestion, and decrease the use of private cars while reducing emissions. Transportation is the second largest cause of environmental pollution in Egypt, which is why this project was so important to the country. And it will also just increase the efficiency of transportation in Cairo. It's going to improve transportation by linking the old city center with the new administrative capital via 2 monorails. and it'll be able to carry 45,000 passengers per hour per line, so essentially 90,000 passengers per hour, and it's expected to be operational this spring. So overall, Egypt's green bond has had a lot of positive effects on the country. First, it has a lot of predictions of positive environmental impact. For example, the Cairo monorail is expected to heavily reduce emissions in Egypt and make transportation a lot more efficient. They also successfully diversified their investor base of government securities, which helped them achieve a medium-term debt strategy, which was one of like their goals behind launching a green bond. And I think another really important effect of their successful launch was like the positive image and investor confidence it brings to Egypt, and just kind of like the global praise they can receive from like so heavily committing to helping the environment and achieving the UN sustainability or sustainable development goals, etc. And they also are a really good example for other Middle East and North African countries and like developing economies on how they can use green bonds as a source of development and sustainable improvement, which is why I think that they're a really good program and thing for countries to implement, specifically like nations with emerging economies, because it's a way to keep up with the environmental protection that the world needs while also developing your country.